a calm radio voice in World War II. Japan claimed America had begged for peace, but hidden beneath that voice was something far more dangerous. Codes, lies, a secret countdown to disaster. Who was really speaking through the airwaves? And what were they hiding? December 1944. Tokyo. The war had turned against Japan, but the airwaves told a different story. Every hour, Radio Tokyo transmitted a message that echoed across the Pacific, a message claiming President Roosevelt had secretly approached the emperor with peace terms. The broadcast was calm, deliberate, and terrifying in its confidence. For those who heard it, it sounded official, like truth dressed in authority. Thousands of miles away, on a quiet island outpost near Honolulu, American intelligence officer Lieutenant Vincent Mercer leaned over a bank of receivers, headphones pressed to his ears. The Pacific night hummed with static, and through that static came the impossible. President Roosevelt has recognized the emperor's divine wisdom and seeks honorable peace. Mercer froze. He replayed the line twice, then a third time. Every syllable was clear, a falsehood, but one carefully built to sound real. Radio Tokyo had used this tactic before, twisting fragments of fact into polished deception. Yet this broadcast was different. Its tone carried a strange authority, a precision he hadn't heard in months. At first, Mercer dismissed it as another act of desperation. But then, an hour later, it aired again. Word for word, identical pacing, identical background tone. Another hour later, again. By dawn, it had repeated 7 times. Mercer had listened to countless Japanese propaganda transmissions. They were usually crude, emotional appeals, reports of phantom victories or exaggerated American losses. But this felt calculated, measured, almost coded. He logged it, recorded it, and sent the reel to headquarters. But before the courier plane left for Washington, Mercer noticed something odd in the recording. Between the words, within the faint hiss of the transmission, there were irregular pauses, too deliberate to be random static. Mercer replayed the segment again, slowing the tape, then again marking down the spacing between the gaps. The rhythm was off, like someone had added something underneath the broadcast. A second layer, buried in plain sight. By mid-morning, Mercer summoned his translator and confirmed the broadcast had aired across the entire network, from Tokyo to Manila to occupied Shanghai. Every Radio Tokyo affiliate had carried it, identical to the second. This wasn't just propaganda. It was coordination. The more Mercer studied the recording, the more it troubled him. The speech pattern was flawless. No hesitation, no background studio noise, no static fluctuations. That level of technical control was rare, especially in late 1944 when Japan's resources were collapsing. He knew enough about enemy communications to realize something. When propaganda sounds perfect, it's probably serving another purpose. The Pacific War was entering its bloodiest phase. Japan had lost the Marianas. The American B-29s were already reaching Tokyo. Yet here was a voice, calm and convincing, declaring victory through peace. The contradiction alone was enough to raise alarms. Mercer reported his findings to Naval Intelligence Command in Pearl Harbor. They replied with a familiar tone of skepticism. Propaganda was the enemy's daily diet, they said. Nothing new, but Mercer couldn't shake it. The message wasn't about morale anymore. It was about manipulation on another level. He began running frequency analysis on the audio tape, marking wave fluctuations, counting silences. Patterns emerged, sequences of long and short pauses repeating every 50 seconds. Not Morse, not random. Something else, something structured. Mercer had seen similar tricks during his cryptanalysis work against Soviet intercepts before the war. Messages hidden within broadcasts by modulating silence itself. But this was far more sophisticated. Whoever designed it understood both linguistics and psychology. As the sun rose over Oahu, Mercer wrote in his log, "Propaganda broadcast may contain coded transmission beneath primary message. Possible use of pause intervals to conceal secondary data. Recommend urgent review. That entry would later become the first classified note in what intelligence historians would call the Echo File. Within hours, the Radio Tokyo message reached American newspapers through intercepted translations. Some editors even published excerpts noting how absurd it sounded. But absurdity was the disguise. For Japan, words had become weapons. Their purpose wasn't to convince Washington, it was to confuse, to seed uncertainty, and to communicate with those already aligned in silence. By December 12th, Radio Tokyo expanded the story. A follow-up broadcast declared that peace is near, as American leadership finally sees the emperor's divine path. It wasn't just a lie. It was a mirror turned toward a desperate nation, reflecting victory even as reality collapsed. In Honolulu, Mercer kept listening. He noticed that each re-airing changed slightly. Not the words, the timing. The pauses between phrases shifted by exact increments. It was as if someone were sending instructions through the airwaves, hiding messages within repetition. When he mapped the pauses against the exact times each broadcast occurred, a pattern appeared, one that didn't fit ordinary scheduling. Each transmission aligned with tide charts of Japan's Pacific bases. Every time the tide peaked, the message repeated. Mercer couldn't explain why, but instinct told him it mattered. He requested additional intercepts, pulling every Radio Tokyo tape from the past month. For 2 nights straight, he listened to voices praising the emperor, mocking Roosevelt, predicting American collapse. Most were propaganda, but a handful, always the same voice, always the same timing, carried the same subtle rhythm. The realization chilled him. These weren't random morale broadcasts. They were part of a hidden system, a network of coded messages disguised as truth. Someone was using propaganda not only to manipulate public perception, but also to deliver encrypted orders. Mercer stared at the reels stacked beside him. Each one carried both a lie and a secret, both wrapped inside a voice meant to sound like authority. For most, the broadcasts were noise. For Mercer, they had become an echo of something larger. A war not of bombs or bullets, but of words, signals, and deception. As the last transmission faded into static, Mercer leaned back and whispered to himself, "They're not just telling stories. They're sending instructions." He didn't know it yet, but that single realization would drag him into one of the most secret and dangerous investigations of the Pacific War. One fought in silence, through signals that hid betrayal beneath the sound of belief. Vincent Mercer had never planned to become a spy. Before the war, he was simply a code breaker, a man who saw order where others saw chaos. In a dim naval office in Washington, he spent years poring over intercepted cables, newspaper clippings, and diplomatic chatter, looking for patterns that didn't belong. To most, they were just numbers and phrases. To Mercer, they were fingerprints, subtle trails left by human intention. He'd joined the Navy in the late 30s, long before the world caught fire. His gift wasn't bravery, it was perception. He could look at a page of text and sense when something felt off, when a message carried 2 meanings instead of 1. Colleagues called it intuition. Command called it valuable instinct. But Mercer knew what it really was: obsession. That obsession had already saved lives once. In 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, Mercer discovered that Soviet interceptors had been quietly monitoring American radio frequencies, collecting diplomatic chatter under the guise of scientific research. It was Mercer who traced the pattern back to a listening post near Vladivostok. His discovery went unacknowledged, classified beyond recognition, but it earned him quiet promotion and a new assignment, one that would shape the rest of his life. By 1944, Mercer was stationed in Hawaii, working for a small branch of the Naval Intelligence Psychological Analysis Unit. Their mission wasn't to fight the enemy on the battlefield. It was to understand how the enemy thought. Every day, he analyzed speeches, pamphlets, and broadcasts, dissecting them like a surgeon cutting through layers of language. His task was simple in description, but impossible in practice. To find meaning within deception, Mercer's desk was a map of his mind, notebooks filled with frequency charts, translation sheets and fragments of intercepted text. The air around him always smelled of coffee and machine oil from the recording reels. Most nights, he barely slept. He would listen to Radio Tokyo for hours, hearing voices that weren't meant for him, words crafted to wound morale, twist facts, and fracture truth. But Mercer's mind worked differently. He didn't just hear words, he heard intention. Each pause, each inflection told him something about the person speaking. And lately, those pauses, the ones he found inside the December broadcasts, were haunting him. He ran frequency graphs until dawn, tracing where the distortions repeated. When the lines formed symmetrical patterns, he knew it couldn't be random. Someone had built structure into chaos. Someone had used propaganda not just as persuasion, but as transmission. Command didn't understand him. Propaganda is noise, his superior had once said. You can't fight noise with mathematics. But Mercer disagreed. He knew that noise, under the right hands, became the perfect mask for secrets. What no one else knew was the personal reason behind Mercer's determination. 2 months earlier, his younger brother, Daniel, had been serving aboard a destroyer escort during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The ship never returned. The Navy listed it as lost with all hands. Mercer never received the full report, only a brief telegram and a folded flag. He replayed the radio logs from that week dozens of times, searching for any clue, any irregular signal that might explain what had gone wrong. He found nothing, but in those sleepless nights, he made a silent vow. He would understand the enemy's mind so completely that no other American family would face the same mystery. So when he intercepted the December broadcast claiming Roosevelt sought peace, he recognized its danger instantly. Lies were weapons, and this one was sharpened with precision. The more he studied it, the more his instincts flared. The cadence of the announcer's voice, perfectly even, always identical, felt engineered. And the odd timing of repeated segments suggested control beyond human hands. Mercer began to suspect automation, that the broadcasts were being triggered by signal timers rather than live voices. If that were true, then the repetition wasn't for civilians at all. It was for listeners who knew when to tune in. His reports grew longer, more urgent. He noted variations in tone, microsecond shifts in the waveform, frequencies outside normal transmission ranges. His colleagues rolled their eyes. Mercer was seeing ghosts again. But ghosts, in his world, had a way of turning real. Even his commanding officer began to worry about his intensity. "You've been at that desk for 48 hours, the man warned. Mercer only nodded. He wasn't chasing an idea anymore. He was chasing proof. He believed that within those polished Japanese voices lay an invisible war, a war fought through the manipulation of sound itself. He felt certain that behind every carefully crafted phrase, someone was whispering instructions, counting seconds, guiding unseen agents. Late one night, after another round of analysis, Mercer stepped outside his listening station. The Pacific air was cool. Ships in the harbor lay quiet, their lights dimmed for blackout. He looked across the dark horizon and thought of his brother, of the thousands of sailors like him, fighting in the open, while men like Mercer fought in silence. He realized something then, that his enemy wasn't the voice on the radio. It was the idea that truth itself could be controlled, reshaped, and broadcast to millions as fact. And that realization changed him. From that night onward, he no longer saw his job as decoding propaganda. He saw it as exposing the machinery behind it, the system that turned lies into weapons and information into control. In the months to come, that conviction would lead him down a path no codebreaker had walked before, a path through false broadcasts, buried orders, and hidden traitors operating under America's own flag. But for now, as the sound of Radio Tokyo faded into static once more, Mercer leaned back over his receiver and whispered a quiet promise to himself. If they're hiding something inside their words, I'll find it. By the final winter of 1944, Japan's empire was shrinking by the day. The Marianas were lost. The skies above Tokyo were no longer safe. B-29 bombers roamed freely, dropping fire on cities that once stood untouchable. Yet inside those burning cities, the radio told a different story. A story of victories that never happened and negotiations that never existed. Behind those broadcasts stood an empire of deception, like Imperial Rule Assistance Associations. Information Bureau, the organization historians would later call the Ministry of Lies. Its purpose was simple in theory: maintain morale, preserve faith in the emperor, and keep the illusion of control alive. But in reality, it had become something far more dangerous. The Bureau's writers crafted messages that wrapped defeat in language of divine destiny. They transformed setbacks into signs of sacred endurance. Temporary reverses, they called them, tests of faith. It wasn't just information control, it was psychological survival for a nation facing collapse. And within this machine of illusion, the line between truth and fiction no longer existed. Mercer had studied hundreds of these messages, hollow words wrapped in elegant phrasing. But what troubled him now was their precision. The latest Radio Tokyo broadcasts carried timestamps and phrases that matched no known propaganda pattern. Each aired simultaneously across occupied Asia, from Singapore to Saigon, at exact intervals, as if someone wanted them synchronized to the second. That level of precision was unnecessary for morale, but it was perfect for coded communication. Through captured Japanese documents, Mercer pieced together the organizational structure of the Bureau. Beneath the polished language and patriotic slogans, the Information Bureau had become a hub for secret coordination between the Army, Navy, and intelligence ministries. Officially, they crafted speeches. Unofficially, they carried messages for those working far beyond the front lines. The deeper Mercer looked, the more disturbing the pattern became. Intercepted reports from field stations mentioned unusual activity among Japanese agents in Hawaii, Guam, and even mainland California, the same regions where the propaganda broadcasts were strongest. Then came a file from Washington, decrypted fragments from a captured Japanese courier. The documents referenced echo protocols, sequences of words embedded in civilian broadcasts. Each sequence corresponded to a specific operational update. Mercer compared the dates listed in those fragments to the Radio Tokyo transmissions he'd logged. They matched exactly. It was no longer theory. The propaganda wasn't just shaping belief, it was carrying hidden instructions. Mercer wrote a detailed report outlining his findings. The broadcasts claiming that America begged for peace coincided with movements of suspected sleeper agents in the Pacific territories. Certain phrases, honorable surrender, Western tide, divine reconciliation, appeared in both the broadcasts and in intercepted letters from known Japanese sympathizers. It was a network operating under the cover of persuasion, transmitting commands disguised as news. Naval intelligence responded with quiet disbelief. They urged caution, reminding Mercer that propaganda analysis wasn't evidence of espionage. But Mercer knew better. He'd seen it before. Patterns dismissed as coincidence until it was too late. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Bureau faced its own crisis. The truth was slipping through the cracks. Civilians whispered about bombings, about rice shortages, about friends who never returned. The air raids had made denial impossible. Yet, the Bureau's broadcasts continued, louder and more confident, as if volume alone could drown reality. They weren't speaking to civilians anymore. They were speaking to loyalists, to those still willing to believe. In that same period, a new voice began to rise across the airwaves, that of Eva Toguri, better known later as Tokyo Rose. Her broadcasts mocked Allied forces, blending pop music with subtle psychological manipulation. To American soldiers, she was a voice of curiosity. To Japanese propagandists, she was proof of how sound could wound morale. To Mercer, she was a clue. The professionalism of her recordings indicated access to advanced radio equipment that could also produce precisely timed, layered transmissions. Mercer began cross-referencing Tokyo Rose's program logs with the peace broadcast timeline. The overlap was striking. On 3 separate nights, her shows aired within minutes of the coded propaganda messages. It couldn't be chance. The Ministry of Lies had learned to weaponize entertainment itself. But beneath the official propaganda machine, Mercer found something even darker. Through decrypted intelligence from Manila, he discovered a reference to Project Chrysanthemum, a secret directive linking Japanese military intelligence to covert agents along America's west coast. The report hinted that coded transmissions were being sent within civilian radio frequencies, meant for sleepers who could act when ordered. The pieces began to align. The America begging for peace narrative wasn't just psychological warfare. It was camouflage, a perfect cover for hidden communications with operatives embedded deep within the enemy's own homeland. Mercer's pulse quickened as he compared timestamps. Several coded segments matched reports of minor sabotage events along coastal docks, unexplained fires, delayed shipments, and electrical disruptions. To the public, they were accidents. To Mercer, they were echoes, small tremors of a larger threat. He sent a new message to Naval Intelligence Headquarters. Propaganda may conceal network communications. Correlation found between transmission intervals and domestic incidents. Recommend immediate counterintelligence review. This time, the reply came slower. There were political concerns, public panic, racial tension. Any suggestion that Japanese agents operated inside the United States risked igniting fear across the West Coast. Officials urged discretion. Mercer was told to continue analysis, but avoid drawing conclusive assumptions. That phrase haunted him. Avoid assumptions. Yet every pattern screamed purpose. The more he listened, the more he felt watched. The broadcasts no longer felt distant. The rhythm, the perfect spacing, the faint audio anomalies, they followed him. He started noticing the same phrases even in unrelated transmissions. It was as if the entire Pacific network had become one machine, running on lies, pulsing with secret code. He began to suspect that some within the Bureau, perhaps even within Japan's intelligence circles, were using propaganda for their own ends, without full government knowledge. The broadcasts had become a web, one that might even entangle those who created it. By the end of December, Mercer filled 3 notebooks with coded intervals and hidden phrase maps. Each one revealed another layer of intent. The Ministry of Lies had mastered the art of deception, not only against enemies abroad, but within its own collapsing empire. As Tokyo burned under B-29 fire, its airwaves remained calm. The broadcasts still spoke of peace negotiations and divine guidance. But Mercer knew better now. Behind every polished word was something else, a secret pulse, a buried instruction, a whisper meant for ears that weren't supposed to exist. And somewhere, he realized, someone on American soil was listening. The day Mercer began breaking the code, the war outside his listening room felt strangely distant. The Pacific sun burned through the windows, but he barely noticed. On his desk lay 7 reels of intercepted Radio Tokyo broadcasts, all identical on the surface, yet carrying a secret rhythm beneath. He lined up the recordings by timestamp. Each one repeated the same fabricated announcement. America seeks honorable peace under the Emperor's divine wisdom. Yet Mercer's notes focused not on the words, but the spaces between them. The silences. He slowed each broadcast to half speed and began counting the pauses, logging them as long and short intervals. He marked each pattern by hand, tracing the rhythm like a heartbeat. It wasn't random static. It was deliberate. Every broadcast carried a repeating structure, a hidden cadence buried within propaganda's voice. Mercer worked alone, his office a maze of papers and maps. Colleagues had stopped asking what he was doing. Most believed he was chasing illusions. Yet to him, illusion was the only truth worth chasing. The Ministry of Lies had built an empire on rhythm and repetition. He was simply following its pulse. One night, after 40 hours without rest, Mercer saw something strange. The sequence of pauses mirrored the number pattern from an old cipher he'd studied before the war, a book cipher, where words were hidden through references to printed materials. He'd used similar systems against Soviet intercepts, but here, the broadcast itself was the carrier. He pulled out stacks of American newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Los Angeles Examiner, the New York Herald. These were papers commonly distributed on the West Coast, accessible to any Japanese sympathizer or sleeper agent. Mercer suspected the broadcasts didn't transmit new information at all. They transmitted page references. He began cross-referencing. Every long pause represented a column, every short pause a line. Within hours, a phrase appeared across multiple broadcasts. West Coast ports, December. Then another. Storage, supply, prepare. The broadcasts weren't declarations of victory. They were instructions. The realization struck him like a physical blow. The coded messages were guiding sabotage operations against American targets, specifically West Coast infrastructure. And the timing of the transmissions matched troop resupply schedules for the Philippines campaign. If those supply lines were disrupted, MacArthur's return could be delayed for months. Mercer rushed his findings to Naval Intelligence Command. He presented his notes, the cipher logic, the matching timestamps. The officers listened, but their expressions remained cautious. They needed physical proof, they said. Confirmation beyond theory. Without that, the broadcasts were just propaganda. Mercer left the meeting furious. Proof. That was always the word. But what was proof in a war fought through deception? The broadcasts were self-erasing evidence, messages that vanished into the ether the moment they aired. He returned to his post and began listening again, this time through the night. Every hour, another repetition. Every pause, another line in the pattern. His pencil never stopped moving. Sleep blurred into static. Somewhere in the haze of exhaustion, he found something new. Slight variations in the code sequence, like countdowns. The latest broadcasts weren't just issuing instructions. They were marking progress. He ran the numbers and froze. The intervals suggested a completion date less than 2 weeks away. A final operation. A coordinated strike. Mercer's hands trembled as he recorded his findings. If he was right, the broadcasts were announcing the final stage of a sabotage network that had remained hidden since the start of the war. And now, they were almost ready. He filed another urgent report. This time, the message reached Washington. A reply came back hours later, a brief note acknowledging possible dual-use communications. It was the first time anyone had officially admitted Mercer might be right. Encouraged, he expanded his analysis. He compared the phrasing across dozens of transmissions, charting frequency overlaps. He discovered that certain word combinations, divine reconciliation, peaceful restoration, honor of the Western tide, repeated in patterns identical to cipher keys. It was a linguistic camouflage built on spiritual language that no censor would question. Each phrase corresponded to a numeric code when transposed through Japanese kana. It was a system so simple and elegant, it could hide forever inside ordinary propaganda. Mercer realized he was facing an enemy that understood psychology as much as cryptography. The deeper he went, the more isolated he became. Other analysts saw propaganda as theater, a distraction from the real war. Mercer saw it as the real battlefield. Words could travel farther than planes. Lies could move armies. He spent days recreating the likely communication network. From Tokyo, signals traveled through Radio Singapore, then through occupied Manila, bouncing off civilian relay towers that carried them across the Pacific. The final stage was civilian shortwave, open to anyone who knew where to listen. It was a perfect channel for sleeper agents. But Mercer faced one fatal problem. He couldn't determine which newspaper the agents were using as the cipher key. Without that, decoding future messages was nearly impossible. Each publication produced a different translation. San Francisco Chronicle gave one set of instructions. Los Angeles Examiner gave another. He was decoding fragments of multiple realities, each slightly different, each equally plausible. As the hours passed, his mind blurred between fact and paranoia. What if the enemy wanted him to see the code? What if the broadcasts were a trap, a test of American intelligence, designed to expose how they intercepted communications? Still, he couldn't stop. Every new discovery pulled him deeper into obsession. He stopped eating regularly. Sleep came in fragments. He dreamed in waveforms, hearing voices that weren't there, repeating the same phrase, "Peace under divine wisdom." Then, one afternoon, the broadcast changed. For the first time, the announcer's tone faltered. The pauses were longer, irregular. When Mercer mapped the gaps, the message was clearer than ever. It read, "Operation confirmed. Execute upon signal." He stared at the sheet of numbers until his vision blurred. The date embedded in the sequence, December 25th, Christmas Day. He reported it immediately. Naval Command promised to investigate. But holidays approached, and bureaucracy moved slowly. Mercer realized the truth that haunted every intelligence officer. The enemy's lies could travel faster than the truth could react. He remained in his listening post long after others had gone home. Headphones clamped tight, eyes fixed on the machine's flickering dials. Each transmission felt heavier than the last, like a drumbeat counting down toward something inevitable. He didn't know where the attack would happen. He didn't even know if anyone believed him. But he knew this. The war of words had turned real. The Ministry of Lies had evolved from illusion to operation. Somewhere along America's Pacific coast, hidden among warehouses and docks, someone was waiting for the final signal. And that signal would come not through gunfire, but through the calm, familiar voice of Radio Tokyo, whispering peace while preparing for chaos. By late December 1944, Lieutenant Vincent Mercer was no longer just listening. He was hunting. The broadcasts had become his map, and the hidden pauses his trail. Somewhere across the ocean, those coded words were landing in the ears of someone meant to act on them. And Mercer's mission, now unofficial, was to find out who. The first clue came from the FBI's Wartime Surveillance Division. They had intercepted reports of unusual mail patterns along the West Coast, subscriptions purchased in bulk under multiple aliases, all sent to the same post office boxes near major naval hubs. Mercer requested the files and spent nights cross-referencing them with the timestamps from Radio Tokyo's transmissions. One name surfaced again and again: George Takeda. Takeda was a naturalized American of Japanese ancestry, a quiet man in his early 30s. Before the war, he'd worked as a translator for a shipping company in San Francisco. When war broke out, he'd volunteered his linguistic skills to assist U.S. military intelligence, helping translate intercepted Japanese documents. His record was clean. 2 separate security reviews had cleared him, but Mercer saw something others hadn't. Takeda had ordered multiple subscriptions to the San Francisco Chronicle, all under different names, all delivered to addresses that didn't exist. When Mercer overlaid the delivery dates with Radio Tokyo's broadcast schedule, they lined up almost perfectly. At first, he tried to dismiss it as coincidence. But coincidences didn't buy 12 copies of the same newspaper under 12 false identities. Someone was creating cipher keys, physical pages to decode messages that couldn't be sent through official channels. Mercer pulled Takeda's personnel file. The man had access to shipping manifests, naval convoy schedules, and fuel storage maps. Information that, in the wrong hands, could cripple entire operations. And yet his file contained glowing recommendations from senior officers. Takeda was described as quiet, diligent, loyal. Mercer's instincts screamed otherwise. He'd seen that pattern before, the perfect resume that hid something wrong underneath. He reached out to a contact in the Bureau, a field agent named Roy Sutherland, who had been investigating Japanese-American community networks during the early months of the war. Together, they reviewed arrest logs, internment records, and travel histories. Most files were dead ends, but one note stood out, a report of a translator who had traveled repeatedly between San Francisco and Los Angeles, using naval mail channels for transport. No official orders, no record of purpose. The name was blacked out, but the initials matched. Mercer's doubts turned to conviction. Takeda wasn't just translating intercepted messages, he was creating them. He was the bridge between the Ministry of Lies and American soil. When Mercer presented his theory to Naval Command, he met resistance. The war had already stretched intelligence divisions thin. Accusing a trusted translator without direct evidence was dangerous, politically and operationally. Command reminded him of the racial tensions already inflamed by the internment policies. "Be cautious," they warned. "We can't afford the wrong headline." But caution wasn't an option. The clock was ticking toward Christmas, and Mercer believed the next broadcast could trigger an attack on the West Coast. He couldn't sit behind a desk anymore, so he broke protocol. Using a temporary transfer order signed only by his immediate superior, he flew to San Francisco under the guise of Liaison Communication Review. In truth, it was a one-man investigation. The city was dark under wartime blackout. Harbor lights dimmed, docks patrolled by armed guards. Mercer walked the piers at night, studying the workers, watching the ships that came and went without fanfare. Every face could hide an accomplice. Every newspaper stand could hold a key. He visited the Chronicle's distribution office and quietly obtained records for Takeda's subscriptions. The addresses led nowhere, empty lots, closed shops, or non-existent buildings. Yet every one of them was within walking distance of key naval supply routes. That was no accident. Mercer tracked Takeda's movements for a week. The translator lived modestly in a small apartment near Telegraph Hill, rarely socialized, and kept irregular hours. He spent evenings in his room, radio light flickering through the window. One night, Mercer watched from across the street as the glow dimmed, then reappeared 15 minutes later. Someone had switched frequencies. The next morning, Mercer searched the alley trash bins near Takeda's apartment and found torn scraps of newspaper, each with individual words circled in pencil. Storage, tide, dawn, faith. The same phrases embedded in the Radio Tokyo broadcasts. That was the confirmation he needed. Still, something didn't fit. Takeda had been cleared twice by counterintelligence. Someone inside the system had protected him. Mercer combed through the clearance documentation. The signature approving Takeda's last review belonged to a high-ranking officer in the Office of Naval Intelligence, a man with strong political ties in Washington. It wasn't just oversight. It was cover. He began to suspect a deeper rot, a protection network shielding Takeda for reasons beyond loyalty. Perhaps blackmail, perhaps influence. Whatever it was, it meant Mercer couldn't trust his own chain of command. The realization left him isolated. He knew too much to step back, but too little to act openly. If he reported again through official channels, word would reach Takeda before any arrest. And if the broadcasts were right, Takeda was already preparing for something. Mercer needed proof, tangible, undeniable proof, that Takeda was part of the operation. That meant getting inside his apartment. He began to plan quietly. A late-night break-in. No support, no backup. Just a chance to confirm the truth before it was too late. As he walked back to his temporary quarters one night, Mercer caught sight of a newspaper boy stacking fresh copies of the Chronicle for delivery. The boy's voice rang out through the fog. "Peace in the Pacific! Tokyo claims new negotiations." Mercer stopped in his tracks. Another lie. Another signal. He didn't need the radio anymore. The propaganda war had reached American streets. He bought a paper, folded it under his arm, and glanced at the headline. The same phrasing. The same rhythm. The same pattern of deception that had crossed the Pacific, now printed on American soil. Somewhere in those words, he thought, another message waited, one that could change everything. And as he turned toward the docks, the realization hit him. If the Japanese could weaponize truth itself, then even the ink on an American newspaper could become a trigger. The enemy's war wasn't just across the ocean anymore. It had already arrived, hidden in plain sight, disguised as information. The night Mercer decided to break into Takeda's apartment, San Francisco felt heavy with silence. Even the fog seemed to muffle the sound of the harbor, as if the city itself held its breath. The blackout regulations had turned the once bright waterfront into a ghostly maze of shadows and glimmering ship lights fading into mist. Mercer had waited until nearly midnight, when most dock workers had gone home and Takeda's building stood quiet. He wore plain clothes, no uniform, no insignia, carrying only a notebook, a small flashlight, and a quiet determination. What he sought wasn't a man. It was proof, a link between the Ministry of Lies and American soil. Takeda's apartment was on the second floor of an old boarding house overlooking Telegraph Hill. The door's lock was simple. A thin piece of wire was enough to slide it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of tobacco and machine oil, the kind of scent Mercer knew from radio rooms. He swept the light across the room, careful not to leave prints. Neat rows of papers lined the table. Old newspapers, dozens of them, folded with surgical precision. Each page carried words circled in pencil, sometimes single letters underlined, sometimes entire phrases marked. Mercer's heart began to race. He placed the papers in order, scanning for patterns. Harbor loading, night transfer, western light. The same phrases repeated across multiple issues, each aligning perfectly with the broadcast dates from Tokyo. It was confirmation. The newspapers were the cipher keys. In the corner of the room sat a small wooden box connected to a shortwave receiver. Mercer leaned in. The equipment was military-grade, the kind used for trans-Pacific listening. The dial had been marked with grease pencil at specific frequencies. One of them matched the range of Radio Tokyo's propaganda channel. He clicked on the receiver. Static filled the air, followed by faint, ghostly voices in Japanese. The words were familiar. Peace is near through divine wisdom. The same lie, the same tone, the same signal that had started it all. Mercer realized Takeda wasn't just decoding the broadcasts. He was monitoring them in real time, confirming the hidden transmissions for others. The receiver's recording deck held used reels, each labeled by date. Mercer pulled one open and held it to the light. Inside the clear film was a sequence of faint markings, additional modulation lines, invisible to the ear but captured by the machine. Takeda had been preserving the hidden signals. Mercer felt a chill. Whoever Takeda worked for had enough discipline to treat propaganda like gold. Every word, every pause, preserved as data. He kept searching. Inside the desk drawer, he found a small leather journal. The first few pages contained nothing but numbers, column and line coordinates that could only belong to a book cipher. But as he flipped further, a pattern emerged. Dock schedules, names of cargo ships, notes on fuel storage sectors. He recognized some of the terms. They matched Navy logistics codes for Pacific supply operations. This was no longer speculation. Takeda had access to classified information. Someone had fed it to him. Someone inside American intelligence. Mercer took photographs of everything. The cipher pages, the radio equipment, the marked newspapers. His hands moved fast, his breath steady. But just as he began copying the last set of notes, the floor creaked. Footsteps. He froze. The sound came from the hallway. Slow, deliberate, climbing the stairs. The doorknob rattled lightly. Mercer switched off the flashlight and pressed against the wall. He could hear the metallic click of a key sliding into the lock. Takeda had returned earlier than expected. The door opened halfway, spilling faint streetlight into the room. Mercer could see the shadow of a man step inside. Takeda paused, as if sensing something was wrong. The air disturbed, the scent of dust unsettled. He flicked on the light. Mercer moved before he could think. He slipped behind the curtain near the balcony, heart pounding so hard he feared it would give him away. Takeda stepped further inside, scanning the room. His gaze lingered on the desk, on the journal that now lay slightly out of place. Seconds stretched like hours. Mercer could hear him moving closer, could hear the creak of the floorboards just a few feet away. Then the radio came to life. A sudden burst of static, followed by the familiar Tokyo voice. "America seeks the Emperor's mercy." The same broadcast, the same code. Takeda turned toward it instinctively, distracted for just long enough. Mercer slipped out through the balcony door. The night air hit him like cold water. Below, a narrow fire escape descended toward the alley. He moved quickly, quietly, gripping the railing until his hands ached. By the time he reached the ground, the broadcast had ended. He didn't stop moving until he reached the next block. There, beneath the faint glow of a street lamp, he caught his breath and looked back toward the building. Takeda's window was lit now. A silhouette moved across it, cautious, searching. Mercer knew he'd been discovered. The next morning, he confirmed his fears. The apartment was empty. Takeda was gone. His workplace reported him on sudden leave, but no one knew where. The FBI had no record of an official transfer or travel permit. He had vanished overnight. Mercer delivered the photographs and evidence to naval intelligence. The reaction was swift but cautious. They could no longer deny his findings. Yet Takeda's disappearance complicated everything. Someone had warned him. Someone inside the system. For Mercer, the escape changed everything. The investigation was no longer theoretical. The enemy knew they were being hunted. The coded broadcasts would continue, but now the message wasn't just being transmitted across oceans. It was being answered. In the weeks that followed, Mercer worked in secrecy. Every time he intercepted a new Radio Tokyo transmission, he could almost sense Takeda's presence on the other side. Decoding, relaying, acting. The hunter and the hunted, both chasing the same pattern through static and silence. He knew the next broadcast would carry the signal for the final act. And when it came, it would not only test his skill, it would test how far one man could go to uncover the truth before the lies destroyed everything. For Mercer, the investigation had become personal. Takeda wasn't just an enemy agent anymore. He was the living embodiment of the war's darkest weapon. The proof that deception could cross borders without ever firing a shot. And as Mercer prepared for what came next, he understood that time was no longer his ally. The clock had started the moment he broke into that room. Now, the only question left was not if the signal would come, but when. December 23, 1944. The morning sky over Oahu was streaked with thin metallic light when the latest Radio Tokyo transmission reached the Pacific listening station. Mercer had been awake for nearly 2 days, running analysis after analysis, hunting for the pattern he knew was coming. The static hummed through the headphones, followed by the familiar calm of the announcer's voice. Final reconciliation at dawn. When the western tide rises, Mercer froze. He replayed the line again, then again. The timing of the pauses, long, short, short, matched the countdown sequence he had mapped weeks earlier. His pencil hovered over the logbook. The translation meant nothing, but the pattern did. When decoded through Takeda's cipher key, it formed a simple, chilling message. Final operation proceeds Christmas dawn. 2 days away. He double-checked the numbers, hoping fatigue had clouded his judgment. But there it was, the same frequency range, the same structure, the same embedded sequence that always preceded action. This was no routine broadcast. It was a signal. Mercer turned to his calendar. December 25th. He began cross-referencing the date with West Coast operations. One entry stood out. Massive fuel shipments departing San Francisco for the Philippines. Dozens of ships, each carrying aviation fuel and ordnance vital for MacArthur's Pacific campaign. If the enemy sabotaged those ports, the effect would be catastrophic. He contacted naval intelligence immediately. His message was clear. Potential sabotage signal decoded from Radio Tokyo. Possible target: San Francisco port operations. Time frame: December the 25th. The reply came hours later, slow, bureaucratic, cautious. The holiday had thinned staff across departments, and authorization for emergency operations required multiple signatures. The message ended with the same line Mercer had come to hate: verification pending. Pending. While the clock ticked toward disaster, Mercer couldn't wait. He began pulling every intercept from the last 48 hours. Each broadcast carried slight variations in phrasing, but one pattern repeated: a three-word phrase inserted between standard propaganda lines: Divine Tide West. When translated through the book's cipher, the words spelled coordinates near San Francisco Bay. That was confirmation enough. He gathered his files, maps, and Takeda's photographed journals, then boarded a military courier flight that same evening. The engines roared through the Pacific night as Mercer stared out into the darkness, knowing he was flying toward the very city where his enemy had disappeared. He landed in California by dawn, exhausted but focused. His first stop was the FBI's San Francisco office. The agents on duty recognized his name. His earlier warnings had circulated but were never escalated. When he showed them the decoded message, they hesitated. The evidence was compelling but thin. No one wanted to sound the alarm without solid proof. Still, two field agents, James Leland and Peter Harrow, agreed to assist him off-record. Together they began reviewing port access lists, focusing on anyone who might have worked with Takeda. Several dockhands had Japanese surnames, but one detail stood out. 4 of them had recently changed addresses, all within a mile of the fuel depot. Mercer's instinct sharpened. If Takeda was the coordinator, these men were his executors. He cross-checked their work schedules. All were assigned to the night shift on Christmas Eve, the same night the message pointed to. He called Washington again, demanding immediate authorization for detainment and search. The request was delayed. Senior officials wanted verification through multiple channels, but Mercer didn't need more channels. He had the truth encoded in static. He slammed the phone down and turned to Leland and Harrow. "We're running out of time," he said quietly. "We move tonight." That evening they drove to the harbor under blackout conditions. The cold December wind swept through the bay, carrying the scent of salt and oil. Ships loomed in the fog, massive silhouettes loaded with fuel drums and munitions. The 3 men parked near the depot, watching from the shadows as the last shift of dock workers dispersed. Mercer felt every minute drag. Midnight was approaching. The coded broadcast had specified dawn. He estimated the saboteurs would strike in the early hours, when guards were thinnest and security lax. He tuned a portable receiver to Radio Tokyo's frequency. At 11 p.m., the broadcast resumed. The same voice, calm and polished. But the message was new. All rivers return to the sea. The final wave rises with the morning light. Mercer's pulse quickened. That was it, the activation signal. He looked toward the depot. Movement flickered among the fuel tanks. 3 figures, silhouettes against the faint glimmer of the bay. Each carried what looked like toolboxes. Mercer's throat tightened. He recognized the pattern. Saboteurs disguised as maintenance workers. He and the agents moved quietly from cover. The docks creaked beneath their boots. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and sea rust. From a distance, Mercer could see the figures split. One heading toward the northern tank cluster, another toward the main loading platform, and the third toward the elevated catwalk overlooking the depot. The plan was clear. Coordinated charges placed across multiple points to ignite the entire complex. Mercer's mind raced. He couldn't cover all 3. Neither could the agents. They needed to choose, divide, or risk losing all. "Take the north and platform," Mercer ordered. "I'll take the catwalk." The agents nodded and disappeared into the fog. Mercer moved fast, crouching low as he climbed the metal stairs toward the elevated walkway. His boots echoed faintly against steel. Ahead, the figure was working fast. Crouched over a large valve, toolbox open beside him. Even from a distance, Mercer knew the man's silhouette. The posture, The steady, deliberate movements. Takeda. Mercer froze for a second, disbelief and grim certainty clashing in his mind. Takeda hadn't fled. He'd stayed behind to finish what he started. Mercer crept closer, careful not to alert him. From below came faint sounds. Leland shouting, a scuffle, the crack of metal against concrete. Then silence. The noise startled Takeda. He turned slightly, glancing into the fog, his hand reaching for something inside the box. Mercer lunged forward. The two men collided near the valve, the impact echoing across the steel frame. The toolbox spilled open, not tools, but small cylindrical charges with wires trailing like veins. Mercer pinned him down. Takeda struggled fiercely, but Mercer's weight held. The timer clicked, glowing faintly red. 12 minutes, he shouted for the agents. One responded, breathless. They'd caught 2 of the saboteurs, but a third had escaped toward the docks. There was no time to pursue. The device on the catwalk was already armed. Mercer stared at the timer, mind racing. The charges were connected to a central fuse line. One mistake, and the whole depot could erupt. He yanked the detonator wires free, cutting the circuit with shaking hands. The timer slowed, then froze at 3 minutes. Takeda lay motionless, restrained, eyes fixed on the stopped clock. For a brief moment, Mercer saw not a spy, but a man, trapped by his own belief in a lie broadcast across an ocean. The FBI agents arrived seconds later. The remaining saboteurs were taken into custody. The dock was secured. The fuel depot, the heart of Pacific Resupply, stood untouched. As dawn broke over San Francisco, Mercer looked out across the harbor. The ships still floated peacefully in the bay. The sun rose without fire or thunder. The disaster that had been seconds away never happened. But Mercer knew the fight wasn't over. The coded broadcasts hadn't stopped. And somewhere, beyond the calm voice of Radio Tokyo, another message was already being prepared. Another lie ready to travel through the air, searching for someone willing to believe it. Christmas Eve, 1944. The city of San Francisco was quiet under the dim wartime blackout. There were no bright shop lights, no carolers in the streets, only the faint hum of ships in the harbor and the occasional echo of distant bells. But beneath that stillness, Lieutenant Vincent Mercer was preparing for one of the most dangerous nights of his life. He had proof now: the intercepted broadcasts, Takeda's notes, the coded newspapers, the arrested saboteurs. Yet, despite the evidence, most of the operation remained classified and unsupported. Bureaucracy still slowed every order. Senior officials debated due process, while Mercer counted down the hours. The decoded message from Radio Tokyo had been clear. Final operation proceeds Christmas dawn. That gave them only one night to stop it. Mercer arranged a small team. Just 2 FBI agents willing to act without authorization. Leland and Harrow, the same men who had helped him track Takeda before. They met in an empty storage warehouse near Pier 45, where the cold air carried the scent of oil and steel. The port stretched beyond them like a sleeping beast. Dozens of tankers lined the docks, each carrying aviation fuel bound for the Philippines. Mercer unfolded his notes across a crate. He pointed to the map of the harbor, marking 3 key areas: the fuel storage complex, the supply pier, and the auxiliary loading yard. "These are the primary targets," he said. Takeda's coded transmissions mentioned them repeatedly. "If any one of them goes up, the chain reaction could level half the waterfront." The agents nodded. They had no illusions about what failure meant. There would be no reinforcements, no backup, just the 3 of them standing between an invisible enemy and the largest fuel depot on the West Coast. By late evening, fog rolled in from the bay, thick and damp. The harbor lights glowed faintly through the mist, turning the fuel tanks into vague shadows. The few remaining workers finished their shifts and drifted home to families, unaware that their city stood minutes from catastrophe. Mercer and the agents took their positions. They stayed low among the warehouses, eyes fixed on the network of catwalks and pipes above the tanks. Midnight approached. The air felt heavy. The kind of tension that precedes something irreversible. At exactly 12:23, the first signal arrived. Mercer's handheld receiver, tuned to Radio Tokyo, came alive with static. The announcer's voice cut through the noise. "When the dawn light breaks, the western tide will rise. The faithful shall complete their divine task." That was it. The activation phrase. Through the fog, movement flickered. 4 figures emerged near the depot fence, carrying large metal toolboxes. They moved quickly, deliberately, dressed like dock mechanics. Mercer raised his binoculars. One of them was unmistakable. Takeda. After his capture at the catwalk days earlier, Takeda had been released into FBI custody for questioning. But somehow he had escaped. Someone had intervened. Now he was here, returning to finish the work. Mercer felt a sharp mix of rage and disbelief. The man who had built the code, who had spoken through propaganda to reach his network, was walking calmly toward the heart of the port. The same voice that had almost burned it down. "Positions," Mercer whispered to Leland and Harrow. The agents nodded and drew closer, keeping their distance. The saboteurs split into pairs, 2 heading toward the auxiliary tanks, the other 2 toward the central fuel line. Their movements were precise, rehearsed. Each carried a long coil of wire, and one dragged a small wooden crate. Mercer's heart pounded as he followed Takeda toward the main catwalk. They climbed the stairs above the largest tank, the fog curling around the metal railings. The sound of waves mixed with the low hum of the city far behind them. Mercer waited until they reached the top before moving in. Below, the agents intercepted the others. Shouts echoed faintly through the fog. The scuffle of boots, the clatter of dropped tools. Then silence. One saboteur went down, another fled into the maze of pipes. On the catwalk, Takeda was setting the final charge. He knelt beside the main valve, connecting wires to a timer device. The glow of his flashlight illuminated the faint glint of metal cylinders, small, compact, designed for maximum ignition in fuel-rich air. Mercer stepped closer, keeping to the shadows. He could hear Takeda murmuring to himself, not in Japanese, but in English. "For the Emperor's light, for truth restored." That phrase froze Mercer. It wasn't fanaticism. It was faith in a false idea, belief in a lie so deep it had replaced reality itself. Mercer moved. His footsteps rang softly on the steel. Takeda turned, startled. Their eyes met. 2 men who had never spoken but had been at war through signals and silence. For a second, neither moved. Then Takeda reached for the detonator. Mercer lunged forward, slamming into him. The device clattered across the catwalk, bouncing against the railing. The struggle was silent, but brutal. Mercer fought to keep his balance as the catwalk shook beneath their weight. Below them, the harbor stretched wide and dark. Thousands of gallons of fuel waiting for a spark. Takeda fought with desperate strength. Mercer grabbed his wrist, twisting it until the detonator slipped free. They crashed against the railing, the metal groaning under impact. For a moment, both men froze, gasping. Then Mercer saw the timer. It was already ticking. 12 minutes. He shoved Takeda aside and dropped to the control box. The wires branched out like veins, red, blue, green, all leading to small-shaped charges planted along the tank's base. One wrong move, and the chain would ignite. Mercer's hands trembled as he cut the first wire. The timer continued. 11 minutes. He cut another, then another. The seconds fell away too quickly. Takeda struggled to his feet. "You cannot stop it," he whispered. His voice was calm, almost peaceful. Mercer didn't answer. He kept cutting, every snip a gamble between life and annihilation. The timer dropped to 6 minutes, then 4. Finally, he traced the primary fuse line, the one feeding power to all the detonators. He pulled his pocket knife and sliced through it in one motion. The timer froze at 3 minutes, 17 seconds. Silence filled the air. Even the fog seemed to pause. Takeda sank to his knees, eyes hollow. Mercer stared at the frozen clock, chest heaving. the reality of what almost happened sinking in. The other agents appeared moments later, confirming 2 saboteurs captured, 1 missing. It was over. At least, the visible part. As dawn crept over the bay, lights spilled through the fog, illuminating the ships lined along the harbor. They were safe. The city was intact. The Pacific War effort would continue. But Mercer felt no triumph, only exhaustion. He looked at Takeda, sitting silently beside the dismantled bomb. The man's expression wasn't one of defeat. It was confusion, as if the collapse of the mission had shattered his understanding of reality itself. For years, he had believed the voice of Radio Tokyo, the illusion that Japan's empire still thrived, that America begged for peace. Mercer realized that Takeda was both the architect and the victim of the same deception. The Ministry of Lies had done its job too well. As the agents led Takeda away, Mercer turned back toward the harbor. The first rays of morning light shimmered over the water. Somewhere in the distance, another Radio Tokyo broadcast began. The voice spoke calmly, confidently, denying everything that had just happened. Peace through divine wisdom. America on its knees. The same fiction echoing endlessly across the air. Mercer removed his headphones and let the static fade. For the first time in months, the silence felt heavier than the sound. Dawn broke over San Francisco in pale, colorless light. The port was quiet, except for the rhythmic creak of ships moored along the bay. The attack that was meant to cripple the Pacific supply line had failed, but no one outside that harbor would ever know how close it had come. Lieutenant Vincent Mercer stood on the catwalk, where the detonator had frozen at 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Below him, the fuel tanks glimmered faintly in the early light, their steel surfaces untouched. The air smelled of cold oil and seawater. It should have been a scene of victory, but it felt like aftermath, muted, secret, unresolved. By sunrise, Navy and FBI teams arrived to secure the area. Agents swept through the docks, collecting evidence from the captured saboteurs and recovering explosive devices. 17 charges in total, spread across the depot, the loading platforms, and the auxiliary tanks, all linked by timers designed to ignite simultaneously. If they had detonated, the resulting explosion would have consumed the harbor, destroyed 30% of the West Coast's fuel reserves, and crippled the Pacific advance for months. Mercer watched the bomb disposal crew work in silence. Each device was carefully disarmed and packed into steel crates, destined for a secure warehouse far from the city. The men spoke in low voices, their tone somewhere between awe and disbelief. No one could understand how an entire operation had reached this level of planning. Undetected until the final hours. The answer, Mercer knew, was buried in the airwaves. While the agents documented the scene, Mercer walked to the command tent that had been hastily set up along the pier. Inside, a small group of intelligence officers reviewed his reports. He explained the sequence of events, the coded broadcasts, the newspaper ciphers, Takeda's network, the sabotage plan. Every detail was written in the same calm, analytical style that had carried him through months of isolation. But when he finished, the senior officer in charge looked up and said quietly, "This operation never happened." Mercer stared at him, unsure he had heard correctly. The officer continued, "For the sake of security and morale, the details of this incident will remain classified. The public will not be informed. Officially, the fire prevention drills conducted last night prevented a potential accident at the harbor." That's the story. Mercer understood what that meant. His work, the sleepless nights, the intercepted codes, the risk, would vanish into a report stamped confidential. He signed the non-disclosure papers without a word. The fight for truth was over, but so was his name's connection to it. By afternoon, Takeda and the captured saboteurs were transported under guard to a federal holding facility. During interrogation, Takeda revealed little. He refused to speak of his contacts in Tokyo, only muttering that his mission had been ordained by higher command, but cross-referencing his confession with intercepted documents uncovered something more complex. It wasn't the official Japanese government that had directed the sabotage. It was a rogue faction within the Military Intelligence Bureau, officers who no longer believed Japan could win through conventional means. They had hijacked the Ministry of Lies propaganda broadcasts and embedded their own codes inside them, using the empire's own deception network to run covert operations. Even within Japan's propaganda machine, the saboteurs had been ghosts. Weeks later, internal memos confirmed Mercer's suspicion that Takeda's protection inside the U.S. intelligence system had been arranged through blackmail. A senior State Department official, now quietly under investigation, had approved Takeda's clearance after receiving threats against his family from intermediaries working for Japanese agents in neutral territories. The sabotage network had reached higher than anyone dared to admit, but none of it would ever reach the newspapers. In the public eye, Christmas of 1944 passed without incident. Families celebrated, soldiers shipped out, factories kept producing. The nation moved forward, unaware that its largest West Coast port had almost turned to ash. Mercer returned to his temporary office the next morning. On his desk lay the same stack of intercepted broadcasts, the same static-filled tapes that had started it all. The December 25th transmission played softly from the receiver, Tokyo's calm announcer declaring another fabricated victory. America seeks the Emperor's forgiveness. Peace under divine rule is near. The voice spoke with the same certainty, the same rhythm. Yet Mercer knew the truth now. The words were hollow. The operation had failed, but the propaganda continued, endless and mechanical, still trying to convince a broken empire that it remained whole. He removed his headphones and looked around the empty room. The war had shifted back to the shadows. Takeda's network was dismantled, but others could still exist. And Radio Tokyo's voice, calm, tireless, detached, would keep speaking until the very end. Late that night, Mercer received a telegram marked Eyes Only. It confirmed that the sabotage investigation would remain classified indefinitely. The documents, evidence, and witness testimonies were sealed in military archives. Even the phrase Operation Echo was erased from official correspondence. Mercer folded the telegram and placed it in his notebook. He didn't argue. The war demanded silence as much as courage. Some victories would have no parades. He stepped outside into the cold evening air. The city below him had already returned to normal. Lights glowed from apartment windows, and the distant sound of a ship's horn carried across the bay. To the people of San Francisco, Christmas had been peaceful. To Mercer, it would forever be the night peace almost vanished. As he walked along the pier, he glanced once more toward the water. The surface shimmered in the moonlight, hiding the reflection of everything that had happened beneath it. Somewhere across the Pacific, Radio Tokyo continued to broadcast, voices spinning illusions of victory, messages encoded in false hope. But Mercer knew those messages now fell into silence. Their network was broken. Their lies reached no one who could act on them. The war for truth, at least in this corner of the world, had been won quietly. Yet even in that victory, Mercer felt a hollow weight. He had stopped an attack, saved a city, and uncovered one of the most intricate propaganda conspiracies of the war. But no one would ever know his name. And in the war of information, he thought, that was how it was meant to be. August 1945. The war that had once seemed endless was finally reaching its last trembling chapter. Across the Pacific, cities lay in ruins, fleets scattered, armies broken. But the most powerful change wasn't happening on any battlefield. It was happening in the airwaves. Radio Tokyo, once the empire's voice of unshakable certainty, had fallen quiet. The familiar rhythm of propaganda, the polished phrases, the defiant promises, the echo of divine destiny, faded into static. And then, on an afternoon that would change history, the silence broke. It was not the voice of a general or a minister. It was the emperor himself. For the first time in history, the divine figure of Japan addressed his people directly. The recording was faint, the tone weary. In careful, formal language, Emperor Hirohito acknowledged surrender. His words were measured, his phrasing restrained. But behind them was the quiet collapse of everything the Ministry of Lies had built. In Honolulu, Vincent Mercer sat in the same listening post where the deception had begun 9 months earlier. He recognized the signal frequency instantly. The same band that had once carried false peace claims, now carrying the real one. He leaned close to the receiver, the same way he had when this invisible war started. No triumphalism, no denial. Just a subdued voice admitting what no Japanese broadcast had ever dared say. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. For a long moment, Mercer said nothing. The room felt weightless, as if time itself had paused to listen. After all the lies, all the hidden codes and manipulated truths, the Empire's voice had finally spoken truth. Not as propaganda, but as surrender. Radio Tokyo aired the message several times that day. Then, without warning, the signal cut off. No music, no speeches, no commentary, only silence. A silence deeper than any Mercer had ever heard in the airwaves. It was over. But for Mercer, the end of the war didn't bring peace. It brought reflection and revelation. In the months that followed, while Allied forces occupied Japan, Mercer joined a small intelligence delegation sent to Tokyo to analyze the remnants of the Empire's propaganda infrastructure. What he found there was both expected and unsettling. The grand broadcasting center that had once filled the Pacific with words of certainty now stood half destroyed, its walls cracked by bombing raids. Inside, reels of unused tape lay scattered across the floor. On one wall, someone had scrawled the phrase, "Victory through truth." The irony was unbearable. Through interrogations of captured officers, Mercer pieced together the truth behind the deception he had spent a year decoding. The coded broadcasts had indeed originated from Radio Tokyo, but not under official imperial orders. They were the work of a rogue section of Japan's military intelligence, a secret division buried deep within the Information Bureau. These officers had hijacked propaganda broadcasts to send encrypted communications to agents abroad, bypassing diplomatic channels. The most astonishing detail was that many within the propaganda ministry itself had no idea their broadcasts carried hidden codes. Announcers, engineers, and writers believed they were serving the Emperor's cause, unaware that their own words were being repurposed for covert operations. The propaganda was a lie. But hidden within that lie was an even deeper one. Mercer listened to the testimonies of captured Japanese officers. Some spoke with pride, convinced they had served honorably. Others were broken, ashamed that their loyalty had been manipulated by men who turned patriotism into strategy. A few wept when they realized their carefully crafted messages, once meant to inspire, had been used to send orders for sabotage and espionage. In one interrogation, a former code engineer explained that the dual-use broadcast system was designed not by the ministry, but by a group of military intelligence officers desperate to change the war's tide. "When our ships sank and our armies failed," he said, "we fought with words. It was the only weapon left." That sentence haunted Mercer. It summed up everything he had come to understand. When an empire loses the truth, it tries to weaponize belief. In late September, he visited the recording room where the Emperor's surrender message had been made. The equipment still stood there, the same reel-to-reel machines used months earlier to spread falsehoods. Now, they were relics of a vanished illusion. He imagined the engineers, their hands trembling as they prepared to record the voice that would end it all. Standing there, Mercer felt no victory. Just exhaustion. The propaganda war had ended not with a decisive battle, but with silence. That silence was more powerful than any explosion. It marked the collapse of a system that had once convinced millions to believe the unbelievable. As American troops patrolled the streets outside, Mercer walked through the empty corridors of the broadcasting building. The walls still echoed faint traces of the Empire's last broadcasts, fragments of voices layered over static, like ghosts speaking through dust. He knew now that the real war he'd fought had never been about sabotage or codes. It was about perception, the fragile line between what people are told and what they choose to believe. Before leaving Tokyo, Mercer stood at the edge of the Imperial Palace grounds. The moat reflected the pale autumn sky. For months, he had fought a hidden war against lies that crossed oceans. And now, standing in the capital of the defeated empire, he heard the same sound he'd once heard over his receiver. The sound of nothing. No propaganda. No coded pauses. Just silence. As his convoy departed the city, Mercer looked back once more. He thought about the men who had broadcast those false words with conviction, and the soldiers who had believed them until the end. He thought about Takeda, sitting somewhere in an American detention center, still silent about his role in the deception, and he realized something profound. The power of propaganda wasn't in the lie itself. It was in the belief it created. Belief so strong that even after the truth was spoken, the echo of the lie still lingered. The Empire's guns were gone, its fleets destroyed, but its greatest weapon, its manipulation of truth, had left scars that no treaty could erase. The war of words was over, but the echoes would remain.